Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Olick. I'm one of the co-presidents of the MSA, along with Eileen Sierp and Jenny Wustenberg. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today, tonight, this morning, to this, the fifth of our digital MSA sessions. We have a robust program of more sessions coming up. So I invite you to take a look at the webpage for information on those. I'd like to thank Paco Ferrandiz in particular for organizing the dMSA for us and for bringing so many people from so many different parts of the world together. I'd also like to thank Jie-Hyun Lim for suggesting this particular session and for organizing the panel. It's my great pleasure now to turn things over to our Master of Ceremonies, Thea Sinbeck Anderson, who is a member of the Executive Committee and has agreed to moderate this session. So that's all from me. Welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. And thank you also for letting me join this session, which is really a great pleasure. And I think it's such an interesting event and such a wonderful book project that we'll be listening to extracts of or bits of. So the event today will take the form of short presentations first, initially by Jie-Hyun Lim, who will introduce the book series here, and then the authors of the chapters will give a brief introduction to their contribution to this particular book. And following that, Charles Forsdick will give an intervention as a discussant, so drawing perspective on this interesting book projects. And after that, we are keen to first have a small discussion between the panelists and then open the floor to all of you, anyone interested in posing a question to these great persons addressing their interesting research. So my first responsibility is handing over the word to Jie-Hyun Lim, who will introduce the book series here and this book. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Thea, for introducing me. And then my special thanks to all organizers of MSA who made this meeting possible with their very kind efforts and the almost perfect certain skills and the organization skills. This book, the Mnemonic Solidarity Global Interventions, is the first volume of our new Palgrave series that we launched. This is the title of series is Entangled Memories in the Global South. Global South never means any geopolitical South, but rather is a sort of historical positioning of the so-called Rede, a non-center state or non-center historical unities. So actually, with the term of entangled memories in the global South, we try to give an input to the very much Eurocentricity of the global memory studies hitherto. So still, we don't know how can we make it map this a input from the different angle in the different places, which is quite far from the Europe or so-called the West. But hopefully we can do this through this series. And the Mnemonic Solidarity is the first volume of that series. And then, so I will stop here in explaining the whole series, but too many things to be explained, so I will keep here, but perhaps the product. Eve, do you have any words to add to the introduction of our book series? Eve?
You've covered the series, I think, and the mnemonic solidarity theme should emerge from the rest of the next hour. So, take it away.
Okay, and this volume also, I will talk about this volume in 2 minutes. It's a Mnemonic Solidarity. Actually, we are a little bit reserved about our title. Mnemonic Solidarity is a title with a very strong hope, rather than very clear the analysis of the reality of the global memory formation nowadays. But I think that this mnemonic solidarity is a sort of hopeful goals that we memory study scholars may want to reach someday. Who knows? And the global interventions with the subtitle, we'd like to really try to tackle the question of mnemonic solidarity from different angles. For me, this is a global memory formation from the angle of the memory of East European memories of Stalinist terror and the Nazi collaborations, and the certain colonial memories or post-colonial memories in the three continents, and still, yes, the European memories of Holocaust. And the Rosenhaft tried to tackle the Holocaust memories from the angles of these non-white victims of the Holocaust. And the Carol Gluck they mapped a global memories or global mnemonic discourses about the comfort of women and what kind of a meaning does the memory of comfort women have into the global memory formation. And the Aidan and Rede tried to put the African experiences to the global memory formation, and even the African experiences mainly with the focus on Ethiopia and the South Africa, and how could this experience give an input to our conceptual understanding of the memories or genocide and terrors and mass killings, mainly fomented based on the European experience. So we really try to make the multi-directional or multilateral approach to the certain important issues in the global memory formation. That's all that I can say about the volume. And anyone among our panelists can add some couple of words or some sentences. Carol, do you have any sentence?
Well, just perhaps one word, which is that I think solidarity, as you say, may be aspirational. It's not an aspiration that I share. So for me, it has to be broken down into what you actually mean by solidarity. And I think that scholars of memory studies should understand the divergences and the multiplicity that are embedded even in the term multidirectional memory. So I'm arguing for a much looser, more process-oriented, perhaps network kind of definition, if you use the word solidarity. I just want to bring that up because I think even the aspiration, I have questions about.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I'm too much Polonized because, solidarity is always a sort of precious wording for me from the graduate or student days already. So I cannot escape from the alluring the effect of the solidarity in a sense. But let's get back to this point that Carol made. This is a very, very important point for the opening the discussion. So then I will make a very quick summary of the first chapter, a post-colonial perspective. So post-colonial reflections on the mnemonic confluence of the Holocaust, colonial crimes, and the Stalinist terror. So actually, under the umbrella of this triple victim of the Stalinist terror and the Holocaust and the colonial crimes, I tried to put together the different memories of the genocide during the Second World War, or even before the Second World War. So colonial experiences in the three continents, and the Stalinist terror mainly in Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust in the Central and the Western Europe. And then this certain mnemonic confluence of this triple victimhood could be possible thanks to the breakdown of the Berlin Wall. I mean that till the 1989, a sort of a Cold War system worked as a sort of repressive political tool to repress different memories which had been politicized and a certain repressed by the a Cold War political frame. For example, in three continents, in Korean, in East Asian case, the South Korea was a part of the alliance, anti-communist alliance in East Asia. So in South Korea, any experience, any memory of the anti-communist killing or anti-communist political genocide or anti-communist mass killings in South Korea has been suppressed, right? In Eastern Europe, under the grip of the communist parties, it was almost impossible to speak up the memory of the Stalinist terror or communist repression in Eastern Europe before the 1989, although in the domain of vernacular memories or personal memories or family memories, those memories of the Stalinist repression has been kept, but in the official realm of official memory, it was almost impossible to talk about this Stalinist terror. After 1956, of course, there was certain small room for talking about the Stalinist terror, but in general, we can say that the memory of Stalinist terror has been suppressed or repressed and even silenced in the communist era. So suddenly the fall of the Berlin Wall and the really existing communist system made a thaw to the Cold War culture in the globally, and that, in a sense, that was a beginning for the mnemonic confluence of different memories in in Eastern Europe and Western Europe and in the three continents. And then suddenly we can see the very weird entanglement of different memories. For example, in East Asia, certain anti-communist and the memories of anti-communist political terror was entangled with the memory of communist terror in Eastern Europe. So they are totally different, totally opposite politically, but the logic of remembering of those the communist terror and anti-communist terror, in a sense, they began to reference each other in the promoting their own memories of those repressions. So since 1989, we can see the very, very interesting entanglement of global memories globally, really. And also, in a sense, it gives a certain impetus to rethinking the existing controversies of the Holocaust memories in Western Europe. In this article, I suggest a term of a critical relativization and the radical juxtaposition or critical juxtaposition. It's quite, relativization is a sort of taboo wording after the historical strike in Germany in 1986-87. But suddenly, in the new milieu of the global memory culture that the breakup of the Cold War system has brought to us, I think that that gives us a chance to rethink or reframe the wording of relativization or comparability of different memories. So Holocaust and the other colonial memories of colonial crimes and colonial genocide, and also Stalinist terror, can be put on the arena of the comparable memories. So in a sense, it gives us a new surroundings in which we can understand the competition or conflict, negotiations or entanglement of different memories during the Second World War or even in the colonial period. So that's why I called it the post-colonial reflections on the mnemonic confluence of the Holocaust and the colonial genocide or colonial crimes and Stalinist terror. So this triple victimhood, in a sense, I think that is a sort of triple mainstays that supports global memory formation in the 21st century. That might be a sort of beginning of the discussion of this volume. So I will toss the mic to next contributor.
Thanks so much, Jie-Hyun, and it really sounds great and interesting. And I like that utterly transnational element in all of this. So it's really a fascinating topic here. I'd like to pass the word on to Eve Rosenhaft, who's a professor of German history studies at the University of Liverpool, and she'll present her contribution to this this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Thea, and thank you, MSA, for organizing this. My chapter is a response to a moment when a turn in the global politics of Holocaust memory put my own scholarly work in a new light. It happened to be a moment when I had become more active in public engagement myself, so I had a new kind of stake in the game, and I felt at firsthand some of the emotional power behind memory contests. In the chapter, I link an exploration of fictional accounts of Black Holocaust victims with an attempt to understand the explosion of charges of anti-Semitism against representatives of the political and cultural left since 2018. Those charges now often rest on the proposition embedded in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, that certain critiques of Israel are objectively anti-Semitic in that they constitute abuses of Holocaust memory. The connection between Black Holocaust fictions and the anti-Semitism debates emerges as a tension between the appropriation of Holocaust histories by diasporic actors in Europe and America, and the fact that they may find their own historical experience silenced when they want to speak solidarity with Palestinians in the political vocabulary that was forged in part, at least, in answer to the Holocaust. The chapter is thus a reflection on the changing prospects for that multi-directional memory whose unpredictable trajectory in the global memory formation is one of the starting points for the Mnemonic Solidarity project. For the moment, anyway, we seem to be in a new phase in the long history of the contestability of Holocaust memory. Who owns the Holocaust, what it may be used for, when and how we may talk about it, are all up for grabs in a slightly new and unsettled way. I suggest that this reflects a secular shift from the long post-war period in which the terms of a rule-governed world order and baseline categories of human rights were set by Europe's wartime traumas to a post-war world. In one dimension, this is the thaw that Jie-Hyun refers to, the thaw in the Cold War, or at the end of the Cold War. But this world is also fully post-colonial, in that new global interlocutors, and especially diasporic voices, are insistently making their own histories part of local, global North conversations about the present. Paul Gilroy diagnosed the refusal of white Europe to own this diversity of bodies and voices as a case of post-colonial melancholia. And I borrow this term to characterize as post-Holocaust melancholia, the sense of loss of discursive hegemony that informs anxieties about anti-Semitism among peoples whose identity as progressives is framed by the lost world of post-war reconstruction in the shadow of the Holocaust. In the chapter, I develop these themes in two steps: exploring fictional accounts of Black victims of Nazism by writers and filmmakers of African descent. I identify a contrast between the pessimism of African-American authors and the more open-ended and ludic quality of the work of Afro-Canadian and Black British cultural producers. Here I make the point that even within the Black diaspora, post-colonial demographies are challenging the hegemony of middle passage memory and inviting a rethink of the terms of solidarity. Black creative engagements with Holocaust history continue to reflect on historical alliances between Black people and Jews, and this forms the bridge to my consideration of what I call a crisis of mutual recognition. Here I focus on the renewed vigor of a discourse of Holocaust that reinscribes Jewish victim status as its permanent legacy and gives primacy to the moral claims arising from it. a discourse which has been fueled by the defensive posture of the Israeli state under increasingly ethno-nationalist governments. In the anti-Semitism wars of 2018 to 2020 in and around the British Labour Party, and in parallel developments in Germany and the United States, Black and anti-colonial activists have perceived the accusations of anti-Semitism that are provoked by critiques of Israel as silencing their own historical experience. The intensity with which apprehensions of anti-Semitism have in turn been expressed in disputes within the progressive left leads me to ask what's at stake on this side of the debate. And I see a melancholic disposition arising from the loss of authority, a remembered moment between about 1945 and the 1970s, when a vision of Israel as the happy end to the Holocaust became established in popular culture and liberal opinion, at the same time as the Holocaust became the point of reference for a world order based on a cosmopolitan discourse of human rights, but led from the global north. The final section of the chapter considers briefly how all of this relates to the most radical of current challenges to that order in Europe itself, namely the claims of the right in power in East Central Europe to be defending the heritage of white Christian Europe against both an very old-fashioned specter of Jewish power and the newer arrival of Muslim refugees. And here I trial, perhaps somewhat fancifully, the notion of a third variant of melancholia, a post-imperial one, to point to the ways in which some extremely contorted memory politics, especially in Hungary, rest on denying a long history of multi-ethnic condominium in the region, and on forgetting the traumas of forced population exchanges that were part of the post-war settlement in Europe, but also in South Asia and the Middle East. After this tour d'horizon of reasons not to be cheerful, though in the end I find that the very experience of active engagement with different Holocaust survivor groups that left me and my colleagues personally exposed in the anti-Semitism wars gives reason for optimism. Vernacular memory can be generous, especially when people who shared a traumatic historical experience can meet on a level plane of knowledge that enables recognition and the negotiation of difference.
Great, perfect. That was really nice and really, really interesting. And though we could delve into it already, I think the setup of our panel makes it make sense that we move forward and have all these presentations before we start discussing. So it's my pleasure to hand over the word to Carol Gluck, who's a professor of history at the University of Columbia University in New York, I should say. So please, Carol, give us your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm very interested to hear these presentations. They make a lot of sense to me. My chapter is called "What the World Owes the Comfort Women." And in the midst of the surging nationalisms and instrumentalized history around the world today, it is the comfort women, the sex slaves of the wartime Japanese military, who are now central in the vexed geopolitics of memory in East Asia. And so in this chapter, I step back from the nationalistic flag waving and geopolitical name calling, which is East Asian memory politics at the moment, to look at the changes that have taken place in the norms and practices of public memory over the past 75 years, often through the challenges of remembering the Second World War. Now, this is what I call the global memory culture. It's not the same quite as what we've been listening to. It's a question of practices, norms and practices, not content. It has produced very little solidarity, hence my initial comment, but it has generated changed expectations of how nations and societies ought to deal with the darker parts of their pasts. And in the chapter, I identify 5 areas of change. And in this evolving global memory culture, and trace how the comfort women issue figured in each of them. And I'll give you an example or two. The first area is changes in the law, changes in legal process treating past injustices in both criminal and civil trials, in both international and national law. In criminal context, that means changes in the ideas of universal jurisdiction, crimes against humanity, institutions of transitional justice. In civil law, it means legal claims filed by individuals or groups of individuals directly against foreign governments and corporations. The comfort women have been engaged in those suits for 30 years now. In criminal terms, the comfort girls, as they were called by the Allied investigators in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal after the war, were as if invisible because of what I think of as familiarity blindness, which is simply to say that military brothels were a commonplace in many armies. And yet, in all the legal arguments leading up to the unprecedented designation of wartime rape as a crime against humanity in the International Criminal Court in 1998, the comfort women were everywhere mentioned as a touchstone for violence against women in war. A big change then in the legal process. Second area is testimony. Changes in how we know the past. This is an epistemological shift. In the so-called era of the witness, individual testimony took on ever greater salience, particularly in the 1990s. And this was crucial when the nature of past injustices was not documented, as in massacres, but especially in crimes of sexual violence, which are never written down. And since 1991, as the former comfort women told their own stories of brutality and horror, many of them breaking silence for the first time since the war, they generated a powerful archive of overlapping accounts from countries across Asia that even the Japanese courts that rejected their civil suits recognized as, and I quote, irrefutable historical evidence. So the public power of private stories proved immense in ascertaining the facts of the historical past. Now, the third area is the area of rights. And this is an interesting one because we see changes in the notions of obligations that states and societies owe their citizens in regard to historical truth. It begins in Latin America in the 70s and goes around the world. And for decades, memory activists everywhere brought pressure on governments and societies on behalf of the rights of memory. Now, these rights of memory amounted, in fact, to civil rights or social rights. They're claims made by citizens on the state on the basis of human rights and social justice. It's what the United Nations calls the right to the truth. Now, these rights typically consisted of demands for recognition, compensation, apology, and transmission to future generations, education. So it was a combination, depending on the language, of never forget and never again. And the former comfort women laid claim to precisely this list of redress and rights. Now, theirs was a movement over decades from shame to rights, from injury to redress, and from invisibility to citizenship via the rights of memory. The fourth area is politics, changes in practices of national and international politics relating to history. Domestically, governments were increasingly called upon to acknowledge, compensate, and apologize for slavery and treatment of indigenous peoples, etc. Internationally, the wartime past was weaponized in contested geopolitics in Eastern Europe and East Asia, as today, to the point that the comfort women issue has brought relations between Japan and South Korea, two alleged allies in East Asia, to their lowest point in decades. The politics of apology has expanded to a degree unthinkable in 1945, is now a fixture in geopolitical practice, state to state. And so the Korean government continues to demand authentic official apologies from Japan for the system of sexual slavery during the Second World War. My argument suggests that once the conservative incarnation of the Liberal Democratic Party falls, subsequent Japanese governments are likely to apologize, and adequately so, because for better or worse, apology is now established practice in the symbolic politics of memory. And finally, changes in our understanding of responsibility, in our ideas of moral accountability of societies and individuals. You could trace it in the way the locus of war responsibility moved from demonic leaders like Hitler to organizational functionaries who were just following orders, then to ordinary men committing atrocities, until by the end of the 20th century, even more ordinary citizens, bystanders as they're often called, were implicated in wartime actions, not only by collaboration, but also by acquiescence. At this point, transgenerational responsibility became a larger question, with some concluding, for example, that young Germans are not culpable for the crimes of their ancestors, but they are, as Germans, responsible for acknowledging the transgressions of the national past. So my conclusion is that the norms, expectations, and practices of what I'm calling the global memory culture are indeed transnational and global. The Holocaust and the comfort women, which both originated as local or regional memories, became traveling tropes. The Holocaust for genocide, the comfort women for sexual violence against women in war. And when one thinks that these often poor and powerless, sometimes illiterate former comfort women, very aged and very, very often unspoken, as I said, who did not live in the same country or even know one another, that these women helped to bring these questions, ancient as they are, rape, for example, to the attention of the contemporary world, then I think one marvels at the conjuncture of the global memory culture that evolved since the war and the spirit of these women and the divergent, nothing, there's no solidarity there, but fervent energies of their supporters to make such an unlikely story possible. So what the world owes the comfort women, to their brutal suffering then and their courageous actions later, and to their supporters, are consonant with the changes in legal, social, political, and moral understanding of the rights of women, of crimes of sexual violence, of human rights, and of civic responsibilities in times of war, but not only then, also in times of peace, with issues such as sexual trafficking and other violations today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was another wonderful paper, very, very thought-provoking and very, very interesting. Really great. I look forward to reading this book. So our next speaker is Aidan Erasmus, a lecturer of history at the University of the West Cape in South Africa, right? Please take the floor.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Taya, and thanks to Xi and Eve for this wonderful volume and for all the panelists. This is a joint paper between myself and Lauren van der Rede. And so I'm going to do a quick 3-minute something, and then she'll do a quick 3-minute something, so that we can both have something to say about what we wrote. So in our paper in the volume, we have specifically asked, what does it mean to respond to the call for mnemonic solidarity from the vantage point that is Africa, whether constituted cartographically, philosophically, or politically. And in a sense, the paper is trying to ask what the place of Africa is in a global memory studies or in a global memory space. If in the call for mnemonic solidarity, there is implicit a call for the democratization of the global, then where might Africa figure in that particular constellation of the universal, as itself a very specific subject of what the philosopher Suleiman Bashir Jan called Europe's vertical universalism. So it is through this kind of questioning and through this process of writing this paper and being a part of the series that we have come to characterize Africa as a kind of disobedient object of memory studies, one that produces a kind of refusal of the kind that we call puncturing in the paper. So to think about this more carefully, we suggest that one deploys Africa as method and as concept, as something to work with rather than something to work on. So in order to do this, we have in part turned to orality or sound as a mode of inquiring and as a kind of conceptual framework. And in part, sound and its disciplinary modes have been recently and less recently caught up in a situating of Africa, and indeed its parallels elsewhere and otherwise registered as the global South. Sound also has a particular resonance with both history and memory. And the intersection between these two are especially crucial, as we articulate in the paper, in relation to the histories of colonialism, empire, and violence that extend beyond Africa as place. Sound is also, through the act of listening, of recognizing the other, an implicit act of solidarity in and of itself. Part of the work we engaged here was to see what putting these relations to work would look like. So in the paper, we attend to two cases. The first, or the last in the paper, is the states of emergency in South Africa, and the second is the Red Terror in Ethiopia. And as we say in the paper, both cases disobey injunctions to be rendered as constellations of violent events. They refuse historicism as a logic of the past, and they evade a register that would otherwise reduce its subjects and objects to violence laid bare. There is something about South Africa and Ethiopia and their peculiar situatedness within the broader mnemonic discourses around genocide, war, and colonialism that we argue hints at an important limit that we must set to work at if we are to answer the call for mnemonic solidarity. So I'll briefly speak to the case of South Africa discussed in the paper, and my co-author Lauren will discuss the case of Ethiopia. So through interrogating the different ways in which the status of war oscillated in late apartheid South Africa, we look at how terms like war, colonialism, and apartheid are troubled as discrete objects, periods, or events within the mnemonic discourses that surround them. We ask what the limits of remembering are in the context of an unstable wartime or temporality of war, and how subjects are formed in relation to the past in those presents, and how that reveals a set of insecurities around the colonial and the post-colonial state, imperial war, and the work of memory and history. In particular, it reveals a temporality around state violence and a relationship to imperialism most audible in the mnemonic discourses that circulate around the soldier or the figure of the soldier. As we say in the paper, the soldier is the subject that neither history nor memory can hold alone, and is therefore a troubling prospect for a mnemoscape that must exceed the nation in its shape. One such mnemonic device, as we have called it, that coalesces around the soldier is the military tactic of veldkraft or bushcraft, and the deployment of history around the Battle of Salt River in 1510. And it becomes clear how this particular tactical skill of the South African soldier embodied in the practice of veldkraft actually hinges on a set of mnemonic discourses around the orally constituted memory of indigenous practice outside of its own iterations within a colonial and settler historiography. Another example is that of the sunken troopship of the SS Mendi, which is remembered through a performance of the death roll reconstituted within a national discourse which is itself born out of the remains of what Mahmoud Mamdani might call ethnic pluralism. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Thanks so much. And I'll just echo you and say we'll hand it over to Lauren van der Rede from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa to please take us through this fantastic African story.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful opportunity to begin think with you and to just share some ideas. And so I'll just add to what Aidan has said, and I'll offer a moment of pause on some of the gestures we inscribe through the language deployed in the chapter, and specifically the language of eddying and entanglement as modes of resisting the knot. So the eddy, or when verbed eddying, is a word that is synonymous with swirling and with the fluidity of water, whilst the word entanglement denotes the very condition of being entangled, of being engaged in interaction in all its complexity, and importantly with encounter. What both these terms gesture toward is movement, momentum, touch, and the charges that come with these. The knot, conversely, signifies a fixing into place, indeed a strangulation, and a curtailment of movement, momentum, and suggests itself to be permanent. What we have gestured toward in our chapter is that it is in the discourses of genocide, war, colonialism, and consequently the discourses of history and memory studies that Africa has been knotted into place, quite literally. But Africa, we argue, is more than mere location, more than place and even space. Rather, it, to borrow from Frantz Fanon, is a marker of bloodless genocide or colonialism, and thus also be thought as concept and method, entangled with other markers of lived experience textured by expressions of colonialism, genocide, and war. Said differently, Africa speaks across time and space. To demonstrate this, as Aidan has said, we've deployed the examples of the South African states of emergency and the Ethiopian jet terror, and I will speak to the latter of these. So the Ethiopian jet terror was a campaign of atrocity perpetrated by the Derg, a military junta that governed Ethiopia from 1974 until 1991. And the jet terror itself officially lasted between 1976 and 1978, though its fear and the violence of the Derg extends years well beyond this period. In the early 1990s, members of the Derg were prosecuted for these atrocities in what became known as the Rede trials. Interestingly, though, at these trials, the perpetrators who stood before the court were not charged with terror, as the name given to the campaign of violence might imply, but with genocide. A particularity, one might argue, given that the victims of the Rede terror were selected because of their political affiliation, whether actual or perceived, but a particularity or peculiarity provided for by the elaboration of the definition of genocide enshrined in the Genocide Convention of 1948 by the Ethiopian Penal Code of 1957, which extended protection not only to racial, ethnic, religious, or national groups, but also political groups. This elaboration, this touching on and then touching off from the internationally accepted definition, which Ethiopia did ratify, is an example, if you will, of the logic of editing as eddying. Said differently, in a truly post-colonial gesture, Ethiopia and Ethiopians took what had been offered by Europe as a draft, editing and when necessary, elaborating on it. The attempt to administer justice in relation to the Rede terror thus is an example of Africa thinking and again speaking. Said differently, it is an example from Africa, of an African nation, one which itself was never colonized by European power and for decades stood as an empire, in its particularity of an eddying with the global, touching the universal but abiding by the specificities of the local. And it is in this sense that we suggest Africa as signifier must be thought as method for the deterritorialization and democratization of the global nemoscape, and in its discourses, decentering Europe and Eurocentrism, having been engaged for decades now in the process of systematically undoing the knot. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And that was really a series of really great and very concise and very rich presentations. I think that really shows how wonderful this book is. So It's my pleasure to hand over the word to Charles Forsdick, who will act as the discussant and bring us some thoughts on this book and the papers just presented. Please, Charles, do that.
Thank you very much, Tia, and thanks to the MSA for hosting us. I'm delighted to be asked to comment on the book and to set the frame perhaps for the broader conversation we're going to have in the rest of this meeting. Many thanks to the editors and the authors for those concise, focused overviews of the chapters. I think we've now got a real sense of the inherent interest of the book and the genuine contribution it's making to the debates in memory studies that bring us together today. Can I just say that I'm delighted the book is available open access as well. I think this is precisely the type of intervention that needs to be made widely available to those within and outside academia. So we're here today not just to discuss the book, but also to launch the broader series, Entangled Memories in the Global South, edited by Jie-Hyun and Eve. And that series is a provocation and an invitation to start thinking in more democratized and diversified ways about the global memory paradigm, to explore new ways of thinking. And some of those ways, as Lauren has just shown, will be metaphorical. Thank you very much for that conversation around eddying. Ways of speaking of the deterritorialization of mnemonic memory, particularly in the post-Second World War period. Now, for me, the book is a first step in that project. And crucially, the book is in, and you'll have gathered this already, the book is in genuine dialogue with the already rich work elsewhere in memory studies that is grappling with similar questions. Carol, in her chapter, writes about the way in which war memory is often national and the memory of world wars is international. In the area that I work on a lot, and that is memories of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, there are similar patterns. Memories of abolitionism tend to be national. Memories of enslavement and resistance tend to be international. And I think what's at the heart of this book is the question about how we manage those divergences and how we manage the related interconnections. Now, we all know that there are a series of very suggestive paradigms that have emerged in memory studies in recent years. Traveling memory, some of them have been mentioned today: multidirectional memory, palimpsestic memory, prosthetic memory, decolonial memory. I think what all of those terms and what mnemonic solidarity are circling around is how can we rework the stories and experiences encapsulated in memory as they are transmitted and translated across borders into new cultural spaces. And what the book makes clear is that this is a dual process. So on the one hand, we're talking about active internationalization with an accompanying process of decolonization and provincialization. But also, at another level, we're looking at deterritorialization, but also crucially reterritorialization. And I think mnemonic solidarity is a way of which for me is linked to major and minor forms of transnationalism, is really a suggestive new direction as we grapple with those debates. While I was reading the book, I was struck by the way in which it speaks into two contexts, one of which is practice, one of which is memory studies more broadly. And I'm trying in my own engagement to situate this notion of mnemonic solidarity with what's happened in memory practices really over the past 30 or 40 years, when we look since the 1980s, where we have this emergence of what appeared for a while to be a global consensus in coming to terms with the past, a powerfully global convergence over how societies should overcome violent and traumatic experiences. But at least apparently so, because what we've seen over the past decade, particularly in the context of the global rise of populist nationalism, political hostility to global migration, vocal criticism of the neoliberal order. We can add some of the repercussions of COVID-19 to this as well. What we've seen is a really powerful challenge to that consensus, a challenge which I think is linked, and Eve speaks in her chapter very well about melancholia, which is linked to that sense of disillusionment and rupture. What's striking for me, though, and this is why the concept of solidarity seems so important, is that we haven't seen a rejection of memory politics. We've seen a way in which new political formations have embraced precisely memory politics, critiquing and reworking them in ways that often undermine their previous deployment. So, for me, the book asks, what are the practices that have emerged transnationally in the post-memory boom? And crucially, how should we as researchers address them? What new concepts are required? There's a term that doesn't appear in the book very much, but I think it's quite important. Carol talked about traveling tropes. I think translation is important here as well. The examples we look at in the book often emerge in specific niches in which particular memory practices, political and vernacular, are rooted. And as they travel beyond those initial contexts, there are pressing questions around their translatability and untranslatability. So I think for me, translation is part of the testing of these questions around interconnectedness, which the book interrogates and disrupts. And the key model there, and Eve spoke about it very eloquently in her intervention, is clearly to do with dominant paradigms within memory practice and memory studies, particularly that of the Holocaust, which has been instrumentalized and appropriated in so many different ways. And the book in various ways meticulously unpicks that engagement with the Holocaust paradigm, whether it's comparative, and that's the case in some of the work that interests me in Rwandan genocide museums, whether it's more entangled. And I'm really struck by Raoul Peck's new HBO series, Exterminate All the Brutes, which looks precisely at these inextricable connections between the colonization of North America, of the Americas indeed, the genocide of Native Americans, the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans, the imperial conquest of Africa by European powers, and the Holocaust itself. And what we're reminded in the book as well, and Eve's contribution makes this very clear, are the tensions when we talk about the Holocaust as a paradigm between its uniqueness and its generalizability, particularly crystallized in the IHRA definition that Eve mentioned. As I said, though, I think the book speaks into another context, not just of memory practice, but also of memory studies. And one thing it reminds me is this need for memory studies to foreground its relationship to historical change and to be aware of the contemporary, often of the hyper-contemporary. Because I think what we see at the moment, and the book reflects this, is the end of this belief that memory can achieve social reconciliation, which is why the debates around solidarity amongst the authors are, I think, so important. The book also reflects this question about the possibility or the desirability of cosmopolitan memory as a phenomenon, as a concept, something which transcends ethnic and national boundaries. And for me, it also echoes the idea, the fear, perhaps more, that routinized memory practices, especially state-endorsed, can lead to neglect of the past, counterintuitively. And the introduction talks very powerfully about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, remembering as a way of forgetting. So one thing that I really took away from the book is this challenge for those active in memory studies. What's the role of the field? How should memory studies engage with memory practice and memory activism? What is the role of students of memory to debates around political memory? Whether that's in the United Kingdom, where currently we're seeing political intervention in memories of empire and Atlantic slavery, or whether that's in Eastern Europe, in states like Poland. And I really liked Eve's intervention around vernacular memory that she spoke about here, and that reminder that generosity and education really need to be the driving principles. Just to refer you to parts of the book, the introduction, I think, is not really an introduction. It's a manifesto in many ways about mnemonic solidarity. It offers a way of thinking about how much we can forge common ground for articulating the hurts of the past in ways that are productive for the future. It's an intervention that interrogates the extent to which, in global memory formations, and indeed the way in which we study them, marginalized voices can emerge, and crucially forces us to question the reasons for marginalization, which are sometimes as much disciplinary and institutional as they are political and cultural. What I liked about the book is the way in which, as is the case with much work in memory studies, it's rooted in a clear ethics of memory. Jie-Hyun talked about the sense of hope that underpinned his engagement in this book. I think what we see here is a very different take on what the ethics of memory might look like if the majority world, or if you like the global south, were taken as a starting point and not as a bolt-on dimension, seeking new models of genuinely globalized memory studies. Now, I think when we get into the discussion, that key word of solidarity in the title will come up. There are clearly convergences, constructive convergences amongst the contributors around that. But I also have those questions around solidarity, well, between victims and survivors, very different than solidarity amongst perpetrators. And also Aidan and Lauren very helpfully question the concept in different ways, talking about the ways, the risks inherent within it to flatten specificity. Couple of minutes left, and there are two other aspects I wanted to focus on before we open up the broader discussion. One is to do with the objects of study in the book. As is the case with memory studies as it gains maturity as a cross-disciplinary field, there's a breadth to the objects of study, a breadth to the sites of memory with which the authors engage. Multiple locations of crystallization are very clear. Now, some of those are state-endorsed, interest in law, for example. Some of them are much more vernacular and activist. Eve focuses on films and books, and there's an important reminder about the way in which creative spaces are often a vanguard location for understanding what's happening in memory practices. Museums are foregrounded. Carol talks about the recent proliferation of museums, and clearly with museums we have to focus on a more cosmopolitan human rights agenda, but also the way in which a number of populist governments have used them to reshape their country spaces of memory. Carol again focuses on statues, the comfort woman statues, and I think the time in which the book appeared is clearly at a moment when the statues in the broader memory scape were very much at the forefront of our reflection, with the visibility of the Black Lives Matter movement last summer in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. So I think something else we might want to pick up in the discussion is the role of mnemonic solidarity through the medium of statuary in the built environment. The area that I wanted to focus on, though, because I think it's embedded in the book, but perhaps not teased out as much as we might, social media and the digital. Carol talks about the internet as a channel for hate speech. And I think what we see when we talk about mnemonic solidarity is the digital sphere as a place for good and for ill. For me, it's the strongest and most recognizable channel for a politics of memory in the 21st century, which subverts traditional cosmopolitan models of remembering. The digital lacks editorial control, it's relatively cost effective, it's rapidly disseminated, it's a means crucially of creating new communities, communities who might feel excluded or marginalized, and it's a space often without official sanction. Now, when we look at the digital as a space of mnemonic solidarity, I think there are some very positive examples. Haiti, on which I work, well, it's in the digital sphere that memories of the Duvalier years are particularly being collected. But we also see, and this is Carol's point, I think, that the digital can be a space of extremism, where those used by those with or without political power. And we only have to think about the previous president of the United States, but also Duterte in the Philippines, curating the memory of Marcos. Tia, I shall stop in a moment. I've got about another 30 seconds. The final point I wanted to mention, though, because again, I think this is crucial to the book, and it feeds into very important memories for debates in memory studies, and that's the way in which mnemonic solidarity and this focus on global formations inevitably take us in the direction of the decolonization of memory, but not just that, the decolonization of memory studies. Just 30 seconds, dear. I think what we're seeing is a growing critique that cosmopolitan forms of memory and justice that emerged in the boom years are to be seen as neo-colonial. Eve alluded to this, and many of those on the call will be familiar with these debates. Quite a bit of evidence of this, both in practice and in studies. Just to think about the African continent, the broader context of critiques of the International Criminal Court, I think, need to be taken into account by a wide range of sub-Saharan African countries, not just South Africa, but also Gambia, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda. And we also have, I think, a claim emerging for the depoliticization inherent in cosmopolitan memory, which is again to do with a sidelining of debates around decolonization and neocolonialism. Just to finish on Lauren and Aidan's paper, which I think brings these questions to the fore, what I really liked in their intervention was that idea of Africa as being the not just marginalized but disobedient object of memory studies. Challenging Europe central models of trauma and memory, highlighting pitfalls of universalism. And their argument is the one I'll leave you with, that it's this idea that Africa is not a cartographic geological location, but that it is a concept and a methodology in its own right. And that leads them to think about how, in the spirit of this book, we might democratize rather than universalize mnemonic discourse. And what really struck me, and Aidan spoke about this, and Lauren as well, is the importance of thinking about the senses in the memory studies. Challenge to the fetishism of the document and the archive, the role of aurality in memory studies, and discourses of sound. And I'll leave you with their idea, because it was very eloquent for me, this tension between hearing, judicial hearings, for example, in the TRC, and listening. And I think that listening brings us back to the ethics that underpins the project and the contributions to it. It's a listening which encourages engagement, which encourages attentiveness, which includes an openness to forgotten and marginalized memory discourses, and which encourages us to pay attention to the specific niches in which memory emerges before it is deterritorialized and globalized. And I think that need to understand the dynamics there through this process sometimes, and as I stop, you'll understand the irony, sometimes being quiet and listening to other voices is absolutely essential. So thank you to the authors, and thanks again to the MSA for giving us this opportunity to discuss such a stimulating book.
Thanks so much, Charles, for a wonderful discussion of this book and the chapters. Very rich and stimulating, and I liked all the different perspectives that came out on the different ways in which you could think about mnemonic solidarity, making it even actually the act of listening in an engaged way really is crucial, I think, to the thought of solidarity. So before we hand it over for a general discussion, I will allow the panelists to respond to Charles's intervention, but I'd just like to say to everyone that, of course, we really are keen to have an open discussion, and questions are extremely welcome. So my suggestion is that you think about your questions, have them ready, make a mark in the chat with your name saying I have a question, because I cannot see all of you in the screen, so I would prefer to have you listing your wish to pose a question in the chat, and then we can have the questions in the right order, and you can start doing that very soon. But before I'll give the panelists a chance to answer the open questions, I'll ask them to respond, if they like, to all these wonderful comments from Charles. And I think it might make sense to actually take the same order as we did with the speakers, because that would sort of keep us all a little bit awake and ensure that Jie-Hyun is in the discussion as well. So I think we should, if you could also just spend like 2-3 minutes, or if you have more, I'm not going to be very cruel, but I think we also need to get to the open floor discussion. So yeah, Jie-Hyun, if you want to answer to Charles.
I think I don't have anything to answer to his comments, but I want to rather suggest another item to be discussed in the floor discussion. I mean, these, for example, last year, some very important discussions, debates, debates in Germany, and also Grabowski's criticism of the Andreas Wilschung's very much German-centered guilt consciousness, which actually works out to screen the memory of the collaboration in Eastern Europe. So these two items also can be very seriously considered in our consideration of mnemonic solidarity in the global memory space. So I want to just adopt these two debates in last years in our floor discussion, if possible. That's all I want to say.
Oh, thanks. Okay, then I'll pass the word on to Eve, please. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Charles, for that breathtaking comment, which gives me a feeling that we did actually know what we were doing when we put this book together. On mnemonic solidarity, Carol will forgive me if I remember a conversation we had when this group first came together, and we kind of looked at each other and said, "But we're historians, we're not too sure about this memory studies thing," and by the same token, that is to say, I acknowledge in particular Carol's comment in particular about the value of focusing on processes, on practices, and so on. And I suppose it's out of a moment of praxis that my very wide-ranging reflections emerged. I put my hand up to the notion of solidarity precisely in the sense of looking for productive ways to talk about the past together. And if I could come back to where you Charles invoked the question of, you know, what kind of solidarity do we want? Victims of people who have a shared traumatic experience. Yes, victims and perpetrators, well, maybe not. And there I hear the echo of the work on agonistic memory that I know that you've cited to me in the past, and there I think again, you know, people who work on agonistic memory are now focusing on practices, and I just want to cite a current case, which is in some senses the outgrowth of the continuing conversation in the UK that I was referred to in my piece, and that's the whole discussion of colonialism. The ways in which colonialism is acknowledged as well as commemorated in some of our leading UK institutions, like through the National Trust. Most recently, the question of the recent revelation, which isn't particularly new, that hundreds of thousands of African and Asians who were part of the British forces in the First World War are not commemorated by name at all. These are all issues that are very much churning around in the milieu that you and I share, Charles, and it shapes up as, along with the parallel discussion about structural racism, as a face-off between the colonial subjects and the metropolitan subjects, between the Black community and the white, and the one area where it seems to me, if we were thinking about work in schools, and we might, people haven't talked about is bringing the children and grandchildren of the colonizers, of those people who were, those working class people who were deployed in the colonies, together with the children and grandchildren of the colonized, to talk on that kind of level playing field of discourse about a shared history and what we do with it. So that's, again, coming back to the notion of practical conversations, if not necessarily solidarities. Thanks a lot, Charles.
Thanks. Thanks. I always love that historian skepticism of memory studies. We all have it, don't we? And we really need to think through it because it's so important and so weird. So thanks for that, Eve, very much. And I'd like to pass the word to Carol for a response to Charles, please.
Well, let me echo Eve's remark. That was a fantastic comment. And I think it goes way beyond our book. And let me just tell you why I respond so much to it. First of all, I really appreciate placing the memory studies of our decade, the third decade of the 21st century, in our historical moment. I mean, what we're living in, that's why the consensus is critiqued now, because the 80s were a very different moment, right? In national, international history, the populist nationalism of our moment really challenges memory studies. And I think it's important to be self-reflective about the metaphors that we're trapped in and the language that perhaps needs more translation than we've given it, because we've let our memory studies terminology become static. It's frozen again, to use that metaphor. So pointing out that you used several Ds: deterritorialization, depoliticization, decolonization, and in a way we need a D, memory studiesization, if you like, of memory studies now to meet our moment. I don't mean that we reject what we've come to learn, but we do need to transform, or to use that metaphor you brought up again, to translate our understanding, not just in place. I mean, that it doesn't work in Ethiopia or Rwanda or East Timor, but that it doesn't work in our time, not just in our space, it doesn't work in our time. We need translation. I'm very much in favor of what you call democratization rather than universalization. I don't think we should use the word universal because they're not universals. They're Euro concepts masquerading as universals. I heard a very moving comment yesterday from a scholar of the Rwandan memory who said the memory of the Rwandan genocide was taken over by white Europeans before we, meaning he, had even gotten to it. And then he listed all these things. And you know, when you hear that story, you realize that it's not just Euro concepts. It's the personnel and ethical stance, ethics that Charles mentioned, of memory studies. That's, we don't even realize that our ethics are also place and time based. So the attention, I think, to the idea that we heard about from Aidan, and about the treating Africa as a memory, a methodological concept, not as a place. In other words, starting, as you said, Charles, starting with the global South, not with the North. This requires changing our own subject positions. And if you think this is easy, it isn't. So the challenge now is really interesting to me because it is methodological. It's a meta challenge as well as a current political challenge that you hear in Eve's work. That's a contemporary issue. It couldn't be more of the moment. But where do we and who are we? Where do we stand? And there's probably no better suggestion than we start by listening. And I really loved your countering the idea of hearings, like in the TRCs, with listening. So I think this is a great moment, actually, for memory studies. I think it's a great moment for us to think about these things in a different way. And if solidarity is the way you want to think about it, well, go with God. I think that's wonderful. It just doesn't happen in my way. I'm looking for commonalities that respect differences. And so I'm trying very hard to understand that you're never going to get, as to my mind, you're never going to get as it was once said very importantly to me, you're never going to get the grandchildren of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo to sit down with the grandchildren of the junta who disappeared their families. It's not going to happen. So how do you live? That's Elizabeth Helene. How are you going to, how do you live together? Or how do you work together? How do you respect differences? And in my work on the comfort women, something I've just recently wrote about how the activists, memory activists on behalf of the comfort women could not be more antagonistic to one another in their subject positions and in their interests in the issue. The outcome is bigger than they are. And that is this understanding of the human rights of women. So I'm looking for different ways of trying to understand the transnational travels and eddies. Wonderful metaphor, actually, you two. And I think we need new language for it. So, and I don't have the language, but I'd be really happy to start with Charles's listening. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Carol. Really, this is such a stimulating and fantastic talk discussion taking place here. So I'm happy to pass the word on to you, Aidan, to respond. I don't know, Lauren and Aidan, do you want to respond together, or does it? No, that'll be a mess, right? So I'll give the word first to Aidan and then to Lauren, and then we'll see how it works, please.
I don't have much to add except to say thank you to Charles for such a generous and generative discussion. I think there's one thing that popped out for me, and that was the question of ethics again. I think there's something about the ethical undercurrent in the word solidarity that is in the volume that I think Charles has just kind of picked out. And I think a word that hasn't come up yet in our discussion is the question of action. And Carol hinted at it earlier, something Ronaldo Walcott has said repeatedly is, how can we live together? And I think there is something about that translatability, that kind of that ethical demand of the kind of work that one must do. I think that is what for me resonated in this discussion. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Lauren, do you want to add?
Sure. I mean, again, just to say thank you, Charles, for a really, really generous discussion, really productive. And then also just to maybe pick up briefly on the challenge towards thinking the digital, which I think is an important one, because of course we are all right now in a digital space, right? Using it as kind of a touch point. And also what that does for thinking ethics in relation to questions of memory. So, I mean, the digital, yes, can be a realm that has the potential to do harm, but also to do care, especially in now, dealing with the pandemic. Many, psychotherapeutic services, trauma counseling facilities have all gone digital, right? Whether that be telephonic or via chat. So there is something happening in this moment, as Carol reminded us, right? To also think about time, the particularity of the moment we are in. That is, as you correctly point out, asking us to take seriously the digital as having potential, yes, for harm, but also for good, but also as foundationally assuming that there is this point of touch that is equal in accessibility, which I don't think it quite is. But yeah, so I'll just leave that there for now. Thank you again.
Thank you, Lauren. And thanks to all of our panelists and not least to you, Charles, for this wonderful discussion. That's really been already really great. And I'm now very happy to open the floor to the rest of the audience and to anyone who might have a question or a comment to make. And I already have a number one on my list, and that is Jie-Hyun. Would like to pose a question for, I think, all of the panel, or would you explain yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I could read only Professor Slim article, so I'm looking forward to read all the pieces in the book soon. My question is general, like now there has been, I'm gladly hearing that this consensus is finally broken and that there is even call to certain dememorization. But then should we not also think about how to, let's say, at least make some kind of complementary connection between memory, solidarity, and emancipation? So as you know, also from the 1980s or this kind of memory consensus, there has been a very strong focus on violence in memory studies. And the other side, so to speak, memory on certain intersectional emancipatory projects, individual, collective, has been like traveling on a much more marginalized scale. So I'm just like, one open question is, could we not think in terms of memory studies to engage more productively with certain sense and conception of emancipation as being a certain trajectory, path, and much more easy to mobilize and construct certain global solidarities, if you want to think, rather than being stuck on the victim perpetrator, on the violence model, and everything that Michael Rothberg also criticized already in his, let's say, past 10 years, but especially in the last book. So kind of moving up beyond, because there is one more concerning, what I also see in different art projects in Germany, but also in discussions, trying to kind of elevate the culture of perpetrators. So like to rethink the perpetrators and so on, while really the focus on the most marginalized and stuff is, let's say, always turned into the figure of victim instead of, in Benjaminian sense, figure oppressed, dispossessed, and so on. So this is this link between, let's say, memory studies, ethics, but also politics of emancipation. So this is a more general comment. And then a more like concrete comment, because I read just Lim's article, was about this confluence, the question of confluence. I very much embrace your position of, let's say, analysis of European frame that has been very much merged into, let's call it, totalitarian or anti-totalitarian perspective, which flattens the whole kind of periods and formations of communist, fascist, Nazis past, and has very problematic echoes in more authoritarian, what we were also discussing, populist movements. But then I have maybe a bit more problems with seeing the confluence of colonialism there. Inside of European Union, at least official memory frame, there is no colonial violence. You have 2009 Declaration of European Union, you have museums, you have European narrative, they all leave out colonial violence. So maybe we have it within the memory studies landscape, certain confluence, which you probably tackled, but within what you also criticize more politically, your intervention in this, in the Polish, German discussion, internal colonization process, Nazism and so on, and these more petty, small nations and their own racisms, I think that we have really big problems still on this level. There is absence of colonial violence. If you think about Hannah Arendt, this is her origins of totalitarianism, thinking anti-Black and colonial politics as origins of colonialism. So this is just like my short contribution to this fruitful debate.
Yeah, thanks. Does anyone want to respond?
I think I have to respond because his Gals actually question direct to me. I want to respond from the second question. I think that we can try to understand this, the second point, from the viewpoint of intra-European colonialism. I think that, yes, Germany, in a sense, tried to colonize the Slavic neighbors. So when I read all these things, it just struck me, oh, how colonialist project it was. And also, I think that even within the Polish debate on the memories of the Second World War and even interwar period, I think that the so-called anti-Semitism deeply rooted in the grassroots level also can be understood as a matter of internal colonialism within the Polish nation state. So, but usually I found that the Poles regard themselves as a country colonized by the Soviet Union. So usually they have a very strong anti-colonial attitude against the Russia and Soviet Union, but they did not keep a sort of self-reflexive the thought on their own past as how can I say, internal colonialism or Polish, so subaltern empire, sort of Poland was a sort of subaltern empire against their weak neighbors. So I think if we broaden these post-colonial perspectives or colonial perspectives into this intra-European or internal colonial one, even in Eastern Europe, I think that we can broaden the scope of our memory culture on the Second World War or Holocaust and so on. And first one is, I think that this victim-centered memory is related with certain very interesting aspect of memory. That means I think memory is very much affective compared to history. We in East Asia, we have a very sharp, we used to have a very sharp historical conflicts and historical debates, and also memory conflicts and memory debates. Then I found that usually memory conflicts is much sharper than history conflicts or history controversies. Why? I used to ask myself, because memory is more effective than history. History tries to appeal to the sort of reason or understanding, but memory tries to appeal to certain certain affections, right? So I think that affective memory is one of the very important aspects why the memory studies is very important. It becomes more and more important in the 21st century, because compared to history, the memory is more affection-oriented, or it can move people more quickly or more easily than history per se. So emancipation, in this sense, emancipation is more, how can I say, more logos-oriented rather than emotion-oriented, right? That's why this certain empathy towards the victims were more, how can I say, generated more very moving or certain a vortex of the certain people's mind compared to historical conflicts. That's my very, very rough response to your questions.
Yes, Carol, you may say something if that's what you want to do.
Yes, in a way, I think, Jie-Hyun, I think you're right. You're certainly right about affect. But, you know, if you think back to nationalism in the early 19th century, when it was emancipatory, all right, now we don't think it's not emancipatory, but it was an emancipatory and it was a passion. It had all the affect and emotion. The idea of memory as emancipation is actually in many ways, and this is, I don't mean to be this to be a pun, but it is potentially liberating, because when I talk about the rights of memory, most of these people who are asserting the rights of memory want to be emancipated by from their marginal positions in the societies they live in today. It's their present position that animates their memory politics. Marginalized in the past because marginalized in the present. So I actually think that a liberating aspect, or maybe talk in terms of equity, an aspect that raises people from the margins to a more equitable citizenship or whatever, I think that's a very positive idea. And there, I will vote for solidarity. So I really thank you for that one, for that idea.
Great, thanks. I think we might want to take a couple of questions maybe, and I'm a little bit confused. There's a question perhaps from Jenny about Europeans and their concepts. Do you want to pose it live? Oh, no, it's not a question, I realize, it's a comment. Okay, then there's a question from Mikolaj Kunitsky. Do you want to pose that one? Mikolaj? Live, just pose it if you can. We can hear you if you don't mind.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel presentation. I will make sure that I will read all text, because so far I have only finished reading Jie-Hyun's lean contribution, and it's a very similar question actually to the one asked by Gluck here, considering exploitation. In your chapter, you are essentially focusing on conflation or synergy between colonialism, Holocaust, and Stalinism. You are bringing basically the article, you know, of Gross about Islamophobia and the question of Holocaust. However, I could also come actually with another social debate which has been taking place, at least in Poland these days, and this is the question of the class heritage of the majority of Poles, essentially peasant slaves. So it's the question basically of serfdom, which, as you know, in the case of vast parts of Eastern Europe, actually lasted much longer than in Western Europe. So in Poland, this is basically, or in the Polish-Russian partition, 1863, Russia itself, 1861. Then we've got basically peasant, you know, rebellion in Austro-Hungary. Shouldn't the question of indeed exploitation and serfdom be included into this discussion of memories? Again, a postulate which I think is really dear to me, especially considering some analogies, obvious analogies between peasant serfdom in Eastern Europe and Black slavery in America. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mikolaj. It's our first time to talk to each other personally, I think. Yeah, you know, just let me tell you the story of the 1996, the conference on the 1846 uprising. It's the 150th anniversary of the 1846 uprising in Krakow. Actually, that was held at Jagiellonia University in 1996. And all the Polish panelists talked of that, how the Polish landlords and peasants collaborated together to organize an uprising against the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. But it was not true. Actually, as you said, there was a very, very sharp class conflict, and the Polish peasants, they called this the uprising Polish szlachta, and they just arrest them, they just beat them, and they just handed over those Polish patriotic szlachta gentries to the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. But in my opinion, actually, there was a certain very serious continuity between Communist Party historiography and anti-communist nationalist historiography in their stress on the national unity among Polish szlachta, Polish gentries, and Polish peasants, right? So that sort of the communist official memory in the communist regime and the official memory in the post-communist nationalist right-wing regime, in a sense, by exploring the certain divergence and conflicts that you said between the Polish peasants and the szlachta or the landlords, could be a very important first step to deconstructing national memories of either communist or nationalist one. So in that sense, there's sort of memory to explore this sort of the national antagonism instead of national unity in 19th century or even in the national uprisings in 19th century could be a very interesting, or could be a sort of disrupting these a hegemonic memory in both right-wing and left-wing historiography in Poland. So they can be in Korea, the same historiography you can find. Whenever the foreign country invaded Korea, all the Korean people, from rulers to the servants, they fought against the invaders. But that's not true. That's a simple lie. But still, that sort of memory is very deeply rooted in the grassroots memory of in Korea too. I'm not sure if I responded to your question enough.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Does anyone from the panel want to say something? Actually, I'm exploiting my power just for a second then, because I wanted to pose a question to you, Carol, which was about the question of the recognition of crimes against women in war. Because and I loved your way of sort of telling that story of the narrative of the Korean comfort women actually changing the understanding of the position of women and violence against women. It's just that in my fields, and I work on Yugoslavia and the former Yugoslavia, we tend to think that it was actually Bosnia that changed the view internationally on violence against women. And I was just wondering about the extent to which these two cases know of each other and refer to each other, because I tend to sort of see it, I've just realized, in a very non-solidaric, strictly my case-centered view. So have you seen anything on that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I left out the main story. Actually, the main story of the place of the comfort women in the question of the human rights of women came about through a convergence, or the word we've been using, a confluence of events in the 90s, which essentially had nothing to do with one another. Okay. And there's 10 of them. So let me give you 3 or 4. One of them was democratization, political democratization in Korea, which enabled South Korea, enabled political talk. Second was an emergent 2.5 wave of feminism around the world, which had a different orientation. Third was the changing discourse of international human rights, which moved to women in 1993 in Vienna and 1995 in Beijing. The human rights of women became the phrase. That was a new phrase then. Plus the Bosnian rape camps, right? So the Bosnian rape camps, and what did that do? The Bosnian rape camps sensitized all of Europe, Europe to this question, and they unleashed, in the context of things I've been saying, another factor before I get there, the factor of the changes in international law. So suddenly you get a legal and UN outpouring of discourse on the human rights of women. So the International Commission of Jurists, UN special rapporteurs are sent to study the comfort women, not because they are interested in East Asia or even know anything about it, but because in the context of the early 90s, the human rights of women, the Bosnian rape camps, the feminists, etc., and so forth. I mean, there are more factors. So they're all sent to make these reports. And suddenly the comfort women are in every single document. All right. It had nothing to do with the comfort women. It had to do with trafficking, I forgot there's another aspect, which is trafficking, which has nothing to do with the Bosnian rape camps. All of these things together. So even if they don't mention it, they are all part of the same historical stew. It's a stew of different aspects that are in the same pot, and they don't even know it necessarily. And then they make contact, and that's what produces what happened in the 1990s. That's the long story. Without the Bosnian rape camps, without the international human rights, without all these things I'm mentioning and more, this wouldn't have happened. And that to me is, as a scholar, that's the way memory change happens. And if you are an activist, and I consider myself a memory activist, actually, if you're an activist, you need to understand how memory change happens if you want to affect it. So you would know immediately from this case how many different strands of translated, to use Charles's term, or how many different eddies, to use Lauren's term, were at work here. And so to me, the reason I studied it was not because of the comfort women. I mean, actually, there are lots of other reasons, but in terms of analytic usefulness, it has to do with these interactive, but not necessarily mutually self-conscious, or put it another way, the political positions of the people in this battle were completely different from one another. The South Korean activists had very little in common with the Western legal theorists, let's put it that way. So that's good to understand, because it means if you're an activist, look at who you might make common cause with. I mean, it might not be people in your same bubble, if you like. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's the best part of this story. That the empowerment that came from this kind of stew, if you like, this historical stew, which is not a metaphor I've ever used, and I don't ever want to be, I don't ever want to use it again, but you know what I mean.
You don't want to be quoted for that, because I don't
not for the stew.
Example of how you think historically through the way that really changes. I think the stew is a perfect concept, and we are actually agreeing that we need new concepts, aren't we? So
well, let's not have that one be one of them.
I think the stew fantastically catches up on the idea of solidarity and connectedness in a very uncoordinated way.
May I add one example to this? Recently in the East Asian context, this debate on the memory of comfort women was very closely related with the Me Too movement globally. The Japanese sociologist Mutakaze recently made a presentation in my institute that the strong persistence of denialist discourse of comfort women in Japan is related to the weakness of Me Too movement in Japan. And she just gave us a couple of very interesting examples how these the strong persistence of denialism of comfort women in Japan is related to the weakness of Me Too. So incredibly, to my surprise, this Me Too movement was quite weak in Japan, even weaker than Korea. So I mean that she tries to interpret this in relation to the comfort women memories in Japan. That's one example I want to add.
Thank you all. Does anyone have a finishing remark they'd like to make? Any important last minute thoughts? Well, it has been really a great panel and a wonderful presentation of the book and the papers, and I think a great discussion, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being so generous with your thoughts and your words and your work, and for thinking so well together. And I'd like, well, we can't really applaud properly, but I would have done it very noisily if I could have. Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and thanks for joining us and presenting the work to you. And as many others, I just noticed in the comment board on that. I really look forward to reading the book. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations for the book.
Thanks, everybody, indeed.
In solidarity.
Absolutely.
That's it. Exactly. It was great meeting you all.